Have you ever stopped to think about who is actually in the driver's seat of your own mind?
I mean, it's a question we generally try to avoid.
Totally. We all just go through life with this really deep-seated, incredibly comforting assumption that we're looking at the world, purely objectively.
Right, like a camera just recording facts.
Exactly. You wake up, you look around, and you think you are seeing reality exactly as it exists.
Which is completely fair. It feels that way.
It does. But what if the very lenses you're using to view the world are, well, completely altering what you see?
And perhaps even more terrifyingly.
Yeah?
What if you making those daily observations, you feeling those complex emotions and making those seemingly independent choices is heavily dictated by a chemical cocktail that you had absolutely no say in creating?
Right. It's a profoundly unsettling thought when you really sit with the implications.
It really is. We
Yeah.
desperately want to view ourselves as impartial observers, fully autonomous agents just navigating the world on our own terms.
But the reality of human perception and the underlying biology that drives it is vastly more complex and frankly, far more restrictive than our egos would ever like to admit.
Oh, absolutely. The moment you begin to peel back the layers of how we actually process information, the entire illusion of pure objectivity just shatters completely.
And that is the core mission of our deep dive today.
Yes, it is.
We're going to explore how human beings are fundamentally incapable of observing the world without a theory. We simply cannot do it. Our brains will not allow it.
They physically won't.
Right. And we're going to look at how applying these theoretical lenses to the very real biological mechanics of our brains challenges absolutely everything we believe about personality.
Everything from mental illness to the concept of free will itself.
It's massive. And to guide us through this labyrinth, we are drawing on a truly phenomenal lecture titled How Perspectives Influence Us.
It's such a good one.
It really is. It's part of a broader series on abnormal psychology from the Teaching Company, delivered by Dr. Drew Weston.
Right, he's a clinical psychologist and a director of psychology at Harvard Medical School.
And his ability to dissect these concepts is just, it's brilliant.
It is. And I want to emphasize for everyone listening, this deep dive is not going to just be an exploration of abstract ivory tower psychological concepts.
No, we are getting into the mud today.
Exactly. We are going to be pulling apart the very biological threads that weave together to form your own personality.
The actual meat and chemicals.
Yes. We're looking at the foundational mechanics of how you perceive reality, how your specific brain chemistry dictates your reactions to the world, and how the scientific community itself is subject to the incredibly human flaw of subjective perspective.
Okay. Let's unpack this by starting with a little history lesson.
I love a history lesson.
Let's go back to the early to mid-19th century. Historically, how did people even begin to try and map out human personality?
Because they obviously didn't have functional MRI machines back then.
Right. They had to rely on what they could see and feel, which led to a wildly popular school of thought called phrenology.
Ah, yes, phrenology, the classic example.
The bumps on the head.
Exactly. The foundational premise of phrenology was that you could examine the physical shape of someone's skull, like literally running your hands over the bumps, the ridges, the indentations on a person's head.
Which is just a wild medical exam to imagine today.
It's totally bizarre now. But from that topographical map, they believed you could make concrete scientific conclusions about underlying personality and character traits.
Because they thought the skull mapped perfectly to the brain.
Right. The practitioners argued there was a direct, localized physical relationship between brain structures and specific psychological attributes.
So if your skull had a significant bulge in a very specific area,
They would diagnose you with an excess of a certain trait, like manipulativeness or benevolence.
just based on a bump on the bone.
Yes, they were using the convex and concave nature of the bone to make massive inferences about the invisible brain tissue underneath.
But how granular did they actually bet with this? Like, were they just making broad, sweeping guesses? Or did they have specific bumps mapped out for highly specific human behaviors?
Oh, they were incredibly, almost absurdly specific.
Yeah.
Dr. Weston mentions a fascinating case study in the lecture regarding an area on the back of the head.
Okay.
Today, we know that area houses the occipital lobes, which process visual information. But back then, these phrenologists were traveling around, feeling the backs of the heads of various demographics.
Just gathering data.
Right. And they felt the heads of rugged territorial mountaineers,
Yeah.
and then they felt the heads of domestic housewives.
Okay, quite the contrast.
And they noticed this particular prominent elevation. a specific bump on the back of the mountaineers' heads that was less pronounced in the housewives.
So they just assumed that bump was the biological center of guarding one's turf.
That is exactly what they did.
That seems like an astonishing leap of logic based on a single piece of circumstantial evidence.
It was a massive leap,
Mm.
but they decided that this specific bump dictated territoriality. And here is the tragic irony of the entire phrenology movement. We look back and mock it as pseudoscience, but they were actually trying to be rigorously scientific.
They thought they were doing real empirical work.
They genuinely did. They utilized empirical methods. These practitioners spent years examining literally thousands and thousands of heads to document and validate this theory.
So they had the data, sort of.
They had mountains of data. They genuinely believed they were providing empirical evidence to flesh out exactly which parts of the brain controlled which specific personality traits.
And to be fair, the core idea holds a grain of truth, right? The concept of localization of function.
Yes, the idea that different parts of the brain do control different things. We know that to be absolutely true today.
But their methodology, their execution was just entirely flawed.
Completely broken. The lecturer uses a highly technical term for this kind of widespread, data-heavy, but fundamentally broken framework.
Oh, I love this term.
He calls it a crappy theory.
A crappy theory. It's so perfect.
It was entirely spurious. Aside from the obvious fact that the thickness of your skull does not perfectly mirror the folds of your brain, there is absolutely zero connection between the bumps on the outside of your head and your personality.
Right, unless you've been in a catastrophic accident and your skull has been physically smashed inward, pressing on the brain tissue.
Exactly. Aside from severe trauma, the natural topography of your head means absolutely nothing about who you are.
Which brings us to a crucial philosophical crossroad for you, the listener.
Right.
If a scientific theory, backed by thousands of meticulous observations and years of data collection, can take an entire generation of medical professionals this far astray, why don't we simply do away with theories altogether?
It's a valid question. Why shouldn't scientists and psychologists just abandon the idea of lenses and stick strictly to the cold, hard, observable facts?
And the answer to that question is the foundational crux of this entire deep dive.
Because we cognitively cannot.
Exactly. It is psychologically and biologically impossible for human beings to perceive raw data without immediately imposing some kind of organizational order onto it.
We never, ever just see facts in a vacuum.
Never. We are constantly automatically filtering reality through a theoretical lens before the information even reaches our conscious awareness.
To truly understand how aggressive this filtering process is, let's look at a classic example from Gestalt psychology.
Oh, I love the Gestalt stuff.
It's so illuminating. Gestalt psychology emerged as a major force around the turn of the 20th century, and they were deeply interested in the mechanics of human perception.
How we actually see things.
Right. They fundamentally argue that we do not see the world as isolated, fragmented bits of information. Our brains instantly and automatically force information into a coherent, organized unit.
So what's the famous example Dr. Weston uses?
Imagine an image drawn in stark black and white.
Oh, it's the one that if you focus on the white space in the center, it looks like a solid, ornate vase?
Exactly. But if you shift your focus to the black space on the edges, it suddenly looks like two silhouettes of human faces looking directly at each other in profile.
Right, the faces are the vase.
That is the one. And the critical illuminating point of this illusion is that you cannot perceive both the vase and the faces at the exact same time.
You literally can't. Your brain won't let you.
As the lecturer dryly jokes, there are medications for that.
That's hilarious. So your brain is forced to make a binary choice.
Yes. You look at the raw visual data, and your brain instantly turns it into a coherent theory of reality.
But here's the truly vital part of the Gestalt theory. Once your brain decides what the overall picture is...
Once it adopts a theory.
Exactly. Every single isolated detail within that picture is immediately viewed strictly through that new lens.
Let's break that down. Think about the very center of that drawing. There's a specific curved line.
Okay, picturing it.
If your brain has subconsciously adopted the theory that you are looking at two faces in silhouette, then that little curve in the middle is unequivocally a human nose.
There's no ambiguity at all. It's a nose.
None. But if your brain decides the theory is that you are looking at a vase, that exact same curved line, that exact same cluster of pixels or ink is suddenly perceived as an indentation on the side of the pottery.
It's so wild. The raw visual data hasn't changed by a single millimeter.
Not one bit.
But whether it exists as a nose or an indentation depends entirely, 100%, on the organizing theory your mind just violently imposed on the whole image.
And what's fascinating here is we must recognize that this is not just a quirky parlor trick or an anomaly of optical illusions.
This isn't just a fun book you buy at the museum.
Right. This is the fundamental everyday mechanism of human perception. Let's take a much more mundane everyday example from the source material to prove how pervasive this is.
Lay it on me.
Imagine you are walking down a long street. Several hundred yards ahead of you, you see a shape moving. You do not process that incoming visual data sequentially. You don't say to yourself, I perceive a nose, and next to it, I perceive an eye, and below that, a neck attached to a torso. Therefore, I will synthesize this data and conclude this is a person.
Not at all. That would be exhausting and incredibly inefficient.
Exactly the opposite happens.
Yeah.
You see a percept, an organized, coherent whole.
You instantly perceive a person first.
Yes, your brain imposes the overarching theory of person onto that distant, blurry shape, and then it starts to actively fill in the supporting details.
Because you have adopted the theory of a person, your brain actively expects to see the nose, the eyes, the neck, the gait.
It anticipates them because they fit the theoretical framework.
And interestingly, if you don't find those expected details as you get closer.
So you realize it's actually a strangely shaped mailbox or a shadow?
Right, you actually experience a brief moment of cognitive distress because reality is actively violating your organizing theory.
We're simply cognitively incapable of processing reality without these theoretical frameworks running in the background.
It is genuinely wild to think about how much of our daily reality is essentially a projection of our own expectations.
It really makes you second-guess everything you see.
It does. And if our individual brains are doing this on a micro level just to walk down the street, it makes total sense that entire scientific and academic communities are doing the exact same thing on a macro level.
Which brings us to the philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn.
Yes. He completely revolutionized and frankly turned upside down the traditional idea of how scientific progress actually happens.
Kuhn argued that the public, and even many scientists themselves, have fundamentally misunderstood the life cycle of scientific development.
Because the standard, comforting metaphor we usually use to describe science is building a house.
Right, the brick-by-brick metaphor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We like to think a scientist tests a specific hypothesis, discovers a concrete fact, and lays down an empirical brick.
Then the next generation of scientists tests another hypothesis, finds another fact, and lays down the next brick on top of it.
Brick by empirical brick, slowly and steadily, we build the grand, objective house of scientific knowledge.
But Kuhn vehemently argued against this. He said science is absolutely nothing like building a brick wall.
What was his metaphor?
He proposed that science is much more like weaving a vast tapestry.
And the thread that scientists use to weave that tapestry doesn't exist out in the objective world.
No, the thread comes entirely from their own minds.
The thread is the theoretical framework, the specific lens they are currently using to tie all those isolated empirical facts together into a picture that actually makes sense.
Because again, you cannot understand or categorize reality without those mental threads, even though those threads are subjective constructs.
We just can't function in a state of unorganized data.
Exactly. And Kuhn deeply analyzed how these theoretical frameworks, which he famously coined as paradigms.
Oh, that's where paradigm shift comes from.
That's the origin. He looked at how these paradigms actually dictate the entire life cycle and behavior of a scientific discipline.
Because a paradigm is not just a single theory. It is a broad, encompassing way of seeing the world.
It is a shared set of underlying assumptions, methodologies, and agreed-upon facts.
Think of the monumental shift from classical Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics, or the shift from feudal economic models to classical free market economics.
Right. So Kuhn theorized that a scientific field generally moves through three distinct phases.
Phase one is what he called normal science.
This is essentially business as usual. The entire scientific community in a given field has agreed upon a dominant paradigm.
Let's use Dr. Wesson's example from the lecture. The vast majority of modern economists agreeing that the laws of supply and demand generally explain how markets fluctuate and function.
Perfect example. Everyone in the field is happily weaving their individual tapestries using the exact same theoretical thread.
They are all, collectively, holding the same foundational belief system about how their corner of the universe works.
But inevitably, a discipline enters the second phase. Anomalies begin to appear.
The data stops cooperating.
things happen in the real world, or strange results emerge from experiments that simply do not fit the established paradigm.
The data contradicts the theory.
Now, scientists do not just instantly abandon their life's work.
Of course not. Human ego is involved.
Heavily involved. At first, they try to fix these anomalies with minor, localized problem solving. They write hyperspecific papers, they tweak a minor variable here or there, they create elaborate exceptions to the rule.
They are essentially trying to source a square peg into the round hole of their deeply established paradigm.
The primary goal during this phase is always to preserve the overarching theory at all costs.
But eventually, the dam breaks. The anomalies pile up to the point where they can no longer be ignored or explained away with minor tweaks.
The old theory is visibly failing to explain the reality in front of them. The square peg absolutely will not fit, no matter how hard they hammer it.
And that massive friction triggers phase 3, revolutionary science.
The scientific community enters a state of crisis.
The old order is violently thrown out, and there is a desperate, chaotic search for a completely new paradigm that can actually account for the anomalies.
It is a literal revolution in thought.
And here's the most striking and perhaps controversial part of Kuhn's entire argument.
When the scientific community finally adopts a new paradigm, it is rarely a purely logical, purely data-driven, completely objective step.
Right. He likened the adoption of a new paradigm to a religious conversion.
It requires a fundamental leap of faith.
Let's go back to the Gestalt image of the vase and the faces. The paradigm shift is the exact moment your brain stops believing it is a vase and suddenly entirely commits to the belief that it is two faces.
Once you make that intellectual conversion, say you fully adopt supply-side economics, you immediately start interpreting every single piece of new economic data through that specific, highly filtered lens.
You are looking at the exact same raw numbers that the old economists looked at, but now you see a nose instead of an indentation.
Your entire reality has been restructured.
There is a bit of dark, cynical humor in the lecture regarding how these shifts actually finalize in the real world, too.
Oh yeah, this is a very human element.
Sometimes the only way a completely new paradigm fully takes over a scientific field isn't because the new logic is so utterly undeniable that everyone graciously changes their minds.
No, sometimes it happens simply because the older, highly tenured scientists who are stubbornly, emotionally committed to the old paradigm literally age out and die off.
They just die. A new generation of graduate students comes in, already wearing the new lenses, unburdened by the sunk cost of the old theory.
Science progresses one funeral at a time.
It's so grim, but so true.
If we pull this concept out of the realm of physics or economics and connect it directly to the bigger picture of human behavior and mental health, it becomes incredibly relevant.
Because in modern psychology and psychiatry, there is no single unifying paradigm. We do not have a unified theory of the mind.
Not even close. Instead, there are multiple, wildly competing lenses functioning simultaneously.
And to demonstrate just how radically these different lenses can alter the perception of a single reality, Dr. Weston provides a brilliant, highly illuminating clinical case study.
Let's put this into practice and look at the case of autophobia.
Okay, let's set the scene. A patient walks into a doctor's office suffering from an intense, irrational fear of getting into a car and driving.
It is a severe, debilitating phobia that is absolutely ruining his life.
Now, imagine this exact same patient goes to 3 different mental health professionals, each deeply entrenched in a completely different theoretical paradigm.
Let's start with lens 1, the psychoanalyst.
Okay, the Freudians.
Right. This professional, operating in the tradition of Freud and his successors, is profoundly interested in the broader, hidden architecture of the patient's internal world.
They care about unconscious thoughts, buried feelings, and childhood experiences.
The analyst doesn't just look at the car. They explore what free associates in the patient's mind when thinking about driving.
And what do they find?
Eventually, through deep probing, the patient recalls a specific, highly charged memory. He was driving along, getting incredibly irrationally angry at some pedestrians who were blocking the intersection.
Oh, boy.
And he experienced a sudden, visceral, violent impulse to just slam on the gas and run them all over.
He stopped himself, obviously.
He did, but the terrifying impulse was absolutely there.
Now, wait. For you listening, a fear of cars and an old memory of wanting to run someone over. Through the psychoanalytic lens, how do those connect?
Because it seems like a massive leap to assume a fear of driving is actually about that one specific memory.
It does. Through the psychoanalytic lens, though, it is the only logical conclusion.
The analyst looks at this narrative and concludes, Aha. This patient isn't actually afraid of the metal machine of a car.
The car is merely a symbol, a displaced object.
He is actually terrified of his own deep-seated aggressive impulses. He avoids driving because he is subconsciously afraid that if he gets behind the wheel, he will lose control of his anger and commit an atrocity.
The root cause of the phobia, according to this specific theoretical thread, is the way his hidden, violent impulses are tangling up his psyche and manifesting as a localized fear.
Okay, so that is a deeply internal, narrative-driven diagnosis.
Now let's reset the scenario. The patient takes his exact same problem, the debilitating fear of driving, to lens 2, the behaviorist.
How does the behaviorist view this? Because I imagine they don't care much about the hidden childhood trauma or the buried symbolic aggression.
They did not care about it at all. In fact, a strict behaviorist views the internal narrative as completely irrelevant, perhaps even a distraction.
The behaviorist sees a simple, observable, mechanical problem. The patient has accidentally formed a learned connection between a neutral stimulus, the car, and an intense emotional response, anxiety.
That anxiety is so unpleasant that it leads to an avoidance behavior.
The behaviorist doesn't ask why the fear started. They only look at how it is being maintained.
Hold on, that sounds incredibly reductive. Are behaviorists really arguing that the internal narrative, the terrifying memory of wanting to violently run people over, is entirely irrelevant to the cure?
Yes. Does ignoring the internal world actually work? To a behaviorist, yes, the internal narrative is largely irrelevant to the mechanical cure.
The behaviorist basically says, your deep impulses don't matter. You've simply wired a fear response to a vehicle the exact same way a dog learns to drool when a bell rings.
And their proposed treatment. Systematic exposure therapy. They want to physically break the connection.
The behaviorist will literally put the patient in a car, initially perhaps just sitting in the driveway with the engine off, over and over again.
Then driving around the block. They force the patient to experience the anxiety till the nervous system eventually fatigues and burns out.
They just want to painfully rewire the stimulus response loop until the car no longer triggers the panic.
So we have the psychoanalyst looking at hidden symbols and the behaviorist looking at programmable habits.
Finally, the patient, exhausted, goes for a third opinion. Lens 3, the biological psychiatrist.
And this is where the approach completely abandons the psychological realm.
This doctor completely ignores the hidden impulses of the psychoanalyst, and they entirely ignore the learned behavioral conditioning of the behaviorist.
They look strictly at the physical, biological hardware inside the skull.
Through this lens, the diagnosis is a localized anxiety disorder caused by faulty physical wiring in the brain.
The neurotransmitters in the fear centers are overactive. The chemical signals transmitting panic from one nerve cell to the next are misfiring at a rapid rate.
Precisely. And the cure proposed by the biological psychiatrist. It doesn't involve talking about pedestrians, and it doesn't involve sitting in a parked car for hours.
The cure is a prescription pad.
They prescribe a powerful anti-anxiety medication designed to chemically block those specific neurotransmitters from sending the panic signal across the synapses.
Bam. The psychological problem is solved entirely on a molecular chemical level.
So we have three entirely different professionals. Three completely different, deeply held interpretations of the exact same reality.
One sees problematic psychological impulses,
One sees a problematic learned behavioral habit.
and one sees a physically broken neural circuit.
I mean, which one is actually right? Does the phobia go away with the pill, or is the patient just too sedated to care?
It is rarely a question of one being definitively right and the others being completely wrong.
The medications absolutely can work to reduce the physiological panic, but they might not resolve the underlying behavioral avoidance.
Exposure therapy works incredibly well, but it might be too agonizing to endure without the medication.
As Dr. Weston points out, if a psychologist tried to treat this complex patient with absolutely no organizing perspective whatsoever, they would be utterly befuddled.
They wouldn't even know where to begin asking questions. These lenses are absolutely necessary.
They drastically improve our vision. They allow us to see patterns in the chaos and propose structured solutions.
But the danger is assuming your specific lens is giving you the entire truth.
As the lecturer warns, these lenses are never, ever perfect. Sometimes they are ground too convex, distorting the edges.
Sometimes they're too concave. Sometimes they are just deeply, profoundly scratched by the biases of the practitioner.
A lens can brilliantly illuminate one specific truth, like the chemical misfire, while acting as a total blinder to another truth that might be staring you right in the face.
Like the patient's severe emotional trauma.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That profound danger of tunnel vision brings us directly to what is perhaps the most dominant and simultaneously the most unsettling lens of our modern era.
The biological perspective.
It is very easy and culturally very comfortable for us to view ourselves purely as psychological, narrative-driven creatures.
We spend our lives telling ourselves elaborate stories about our childhoods, our hopes, our traumas, our deeply held values.
It is incredibly difficult and deeply counterintuitive to pause and see your personality, your very essence, your sense of self, as nothing more than a localized collection of interacting neurons and fluctuating chemicals.
This is exactly where the deep dive stops being a fascinating academic debate about optical illusions and starts getting genuinely existentially terrifying.
Think about it. When you ask someone, why are you such a sociable, outgoing person? They usually respond with a narrative.
They say, oh, I just inherently love connecting with people. Or my parents threw great parties when I was a kid and I learned to be a host.
Nobody ever responds to that question by saying, well, my dopamine receptors in my prefrontal cortex are highly efficient, and my baseline neurotransmitters are firing at an optimal rate, forcing me to seek out external stimulation.
We just categorically do not think of ourselves as biological machines.
But the empirical evidence that we are exactly that is staggering. And nowhere is that evidence more terrifying than when you look at what happens when the physical hardware of the brain sustains catastrophic damage.
The most famous, the most studied, and perhaps the most deeply tragic historical illustration of this hardware-software connection is the case of Phineas Gage.
The year is 1848. The medical understanding of the brain is still in its absolute infancy.
Gage is a young, highly respected foreman working on a railroad construction site in Vermont.
During a routine blasting operation, a spark ignites prematurely.
The accidental explosion shoots a massive, heavy iron tamping rod, over 3 feet long and 1.25 inches thick, like a missile, straight up through his left cheek, behind his eye, and completely out the top of his skull.
Just visualizing that is horrific. In the process, it completely obliterates a massive portion of his ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
Just the physical survival of that trauma in 1848, without modern antibiotics or neurosurgery, is a miracle.
He survives. Physically, against all odds, the wound heals. He can walk, he can talk, his memories are mostly intact.
But psychologically, the man who survived that explosion was a completely different human being than the man who woke up that morning.
It was a total foundational transformation of character. The historical records are incredibly clear on this.
Before the accident, Gage was universally known as a capable, efficient, even-tempered foreman. He was a shrewd businessman and a reliable leader.
But with his frontal lobes destroyed, the specific area of the brain we now know is heavily responsible for maintaining attention, regulating social appropriateness, suppressing impulses, and following complex social norms. His former personality completely vanished.
He became lewd and deeply profane. He was highly impulsive and utterly unable to stick to a long-term plan.
He started telling wildly inappropriate, childish jokes in serious settings.
His friends and employers noted that he was no longer Gage. He literally lost his sense of social conscience and his mature identity because the physical meat tissue that generated those abstract concepts was blasted onto the dirt.
That story always sends a shiver down my spine because of the profound philosophical implications.
In the post-accident, Phineas Gage stands in a room and tells a deeply inappropriate, profane joke who is actually speaking.
Right. Is that the soul of Phineas Gage making a poor moral choice to be lewd? Or is that simply his damaged, uninhibited, broken brain tissue speaking on his behalf?
And this isn't just some morbid historical curiosity from the 1800s. This is a terrifying reality that many of you listening might have experienced firsthand with aging relatives.
That is a deeply resonant connection. If you have an aunt who suffers a severe stroke in a specific region of her brain, or a beloved grandparent slowly descending into the neurological decay of Alzheimer's disease, and they suddenly start acting cruel, or wildly paranoid, or completely unlike the gentle person you have known your entire life.
Who is that person? When they say something hurtful, do you hold them morally accountable for the words?
The terrifying reality that the biological lens forces us to confront is that what we typically think of as our soul, our core personality, or our moral center is inextricably, fundamentally bound up in the physical biology of our brains.
If the tissue rots, the soul changes.
We see this deeply entwined, inescapable relationship between biology and complex psychological thoughts across a massive spectrum of mental health conditions.
It's not just physical trauma, it's chemistry.
Take bipolar disorder, which was historically referred to as manic depression. During a severe manic phase, a patient's brain chemistry is essentially redlining.
And the result isn't just that they feel hyperactive. They often experience extreme, narrative-driven grandiosity.
They might develop the highly specific, incredibly complex delusion that they are a chosen messenger of God, or even that they literally are a divine entity.
And this is what is so crucial to understand. You would intuitively think, wow, formulating the belief that you are a divine messenger is a highly complex, philosophical, deeply psychological thought process. That must require a deep narrative.
But it doesn't.
It is actually just the direct, predictable result of specific neurons misfiring and flooding the brain with unregulated excitatory chemicals.
The biological engine is revving too high, and the conscious mind frantically invents a grand divine narrative to explain the sudden massive influx of energy.
It's the brain trying to narratize its own broken chemistry.
Or look at severe schizophrenia. Patients often develop incredibly specific, highly structured paranoid delusions.
They don't just feel generally scared. They will believe with absolute certainty that the CIA has implanted a microchip in their teeth and is actively tracking their specific thoughts.
Again, it feels like a fully formed psychological narrative,
Yeah.
but it is rooted entirely in abnormal brain function.
Even certain cases of temporal lobe epilepsy, when the seizures are poorly controlled, can result in sudden, intense hyper-religiosity in a previously secular person.
It is the physical brain dictating complex, abstract belief systems.
But the most harrowing, the most ethically complex example Dr. Weston provides in this entire lecture is the case of the Texas Tower sniper.
Charles Whitman. In 1966, this young, intelligent man committed a horrific, calculated mass shooting from the observation deck of a clock tower at the University of Texas.
It was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions.
But the tragedy is deeply compounded and philosophically complicated by the fact that for months prior to the murders, Whitman had been writing letters and visiting doctors, desperately begging for help.
He meticulously described having severe, uncontrollable rage attacks, agonizing, blinding headaches, and a profound, terrifying feeling that his actions were no longer his own.
He literally documented his own loss of autonomous control over his mind.
It is so chilling to read those accounts. He was a passenger in his own deteriorating mind.
And when they finally performed the autopsy after he was killed, they found a glioblastoma, a highly aggressive brain tumor growing in a very specific location.
It was pressing directly against the amygdala, a primal area of the brain heavily involved in controlling fear, motivation, and intense aggressive responses.
How on earth does biology explain a calculated mass murder? We want to believe evil is a choice.
But if an abnormal lump of rapidly dividing cells growing in a specific part of a man's brain can trigger an unstoppable violent rage that culminates in mass murder, how do we even begin to define responsibility?
Do we morally condemn the man, or do we blame the tumor? If our biological hardware can hijack our conscious actions so absolutely completely, where does our free will actually live?
It is the ultimate chilling dilemma of the biological lens. And wrestling with that case leads us directly into another deeply held, highly cherished cultural assumption that the biological paradigm completely and utterly shatters.
The pervasive myth of the blank slate.
For centuries, our culture has heavily leaned on the philosopher John Locke's idea of the tabula rasa.
We desperately want to believe that we are all born as equal, empty, pristine canvases, and that our environments, our education, and our parents' upbringings are the sole artists that paint the picture of who we become.
The Texas Tower case forces us to ask where our hardware ends and our self begins. And that exact question completely shatters that beloved blank slate myth.
I mean, parents absolutely love the blank slate theory. Well, they love it with their first child anyway.
Society tells us that if you just parent correctly, you get a perfect outcome. So they read all the developmental books, they play classical Mozart to the baby in the crib, they buy all the right educational toys.
And when the kid turns out polite and smart, they think, look at my amazing parenting. I painted a masterpiece on this blank slate.
But then they have their second child. The exact same parents, the exact same house, the exact same rules, the exact same environment.
And the baby comes out with a totally fundamentally different operating system. One child is naturally calm and easily soothed. The other is a screaming terror from day one.
One sleeps through the night instantly. The other runs on chaotic energy. It becomes immediately obvious to anyone paying attention that they are born with deeply distinct, hardwired biological temperaments.
And researchers have heavily confirmed this parental intuition through incredibly rigorous, extensive twin studies.
The psychologist Arnold Buss and his colleagues conducted landmark research comparing identical or monozygotic twins who share 100% of their genetic DNA. with fraternal or dizygotic twins who share only about 50% of their DNA, just like any normal siblings.
By tracking these infants from birth, they identified four highly heritable foundational traits that seem to be heavily baked into our biology from the very moment we are born.
First is emotionality, the baseline of how generally emotionally reactive, prone to distress, or naturally calm a child is.
Second is overall activity level, their baseline physical energy.
Third is sociability, how intensely they naturally seek out and enjoy human relationships versus preferring solitude.
And fourth is impulsivity, which is essentially the physical speed of their response to external stimuli. These aren't learned behaviors, they are factory settings.
That is fascinating, but how do we definitively isolate the biology? Because even if they have different factory settings, they are still being raised in the exact same house by the same parents. How do we know the environment isn't still the dominant force?
That is exactly the methodological problem researchers face. To truly separate nature from nurture, you need a different kind of subject.
And that is where the real mind-bending, paradigm-shifting data comes from. The Minnesota Twin Studies, conducted by Thomas Bouchard, Oekteligen, and their colleagues.
They didn't just look at twins raised together. They undertook the monumental task of tracking down identical twins who had been tragically separated at birth or in early infancy.
And raised in completely different, often drastically contrasting environments, entirely unaware of each other's existence.
And the behavioral stories that came out of this massive research project, honestly, they sound like poorly written science fiction or episodes of The Twilight Zone.
They really do. Dr. Weston shares some of these in the lecture, and they're almost impossible to believe. The most extreme, stark example is a pair of identical twin brothers who were separated as mere infants.
One of the brothers was raised in Germany during the turbulent rise of the Nazi Party, steeped in that ideology, and grew up as a part of the Hitler Youth.
The other identical brother was raised as a Jewish boy on a communal kibbutz in Israel.
You literally could not ask for two more diametrically opposed, heavily indoctrinated, politically and socially contrasting environments on the planet Earth.
And yet, despite living entirely different lives on different continents, when researchers finally brought these two men together as adults, they exhibited bizarrely specific, shared idiosyncrasies.
It was profoundly shocking to the researchers. It wasn't just that they both generally liked the color blue or both enjoyed spicy food.
The similarities were almost uncomfortably specific. They were both intensely, notoriously absent-minded in their daily lives.
They both shared the highly unusual specific habit of reading magazines from the back page to the front page.
They both independently developed the quirk of wearing rubber bands around their wrists.
And this next one is just wild to me. They both shared a highly specific, strange compulsion regarding the ocean. Independently, throughout their lives, both men would walk into the ocean backward, exactly up to their knees, and then abruptly stop, overcome by a sudden intense wave of anxiety, entirely unable to go any further into the water.
I have to ask, how on earth is a compulsion to walk into the ocean backward, encoded in human DNA? That sounds like magic, not biology.
It does sound like magic, and it's crucial to clarify that there is obviously no walking into the ocean backward gene located on human chromosome 4.
Complex behaviors are not coded that directly. What is likely happening is that a very specific, genetically driven combination of sensory processing quirks, vestibular sensitivities, and baseline anxiety thresholds interact with the environment to produce that highly idiosyncratic behavior.
And we must also acknowledge that in large data sets, some things are just astonishing, mathematically probable flukes.
For instance, Dr. Weston mentions a fluke case where two separated identical twin sisters, without ever knowing of each other's existence, named their respective sons Andrew Richard and Richard Andrew.
That is pure coincidence. But when the Minnesota researchers moved past the anecdotal stories and looked at the hard statistical data across dozens of pairs of separated twins, the genetic correlations were utterly undeniable.
Let's break down those hard numbers, because this is where the blank slate myth officially dies. How do they measure this?
In behavioral science and statistics, they use a correlation coefficient scale. A score of 1.0 means a perfect 100% identical match. A score of 0 means there's absolutely no statistical connection whatsoever.
In the messy world of human behavioral science, finding a correlation of 0.3 is generally considered a solid, highly respectable connection that proves a strong relationship.
Okay, with that baseline in mind, brace yourselves for these results. The researchers measured a person's baseline sense of well-being.
Which is essentially asking, How naturally happy and content are you on an average Tuesday, regardless of what's happening in your life?
For identical twins who were raised completely apart in entirely different homes by different parents, their baseline happiness correlated at a staggering 0.48.
Compare that to fraternal twins who were also raised apart, who only correlated at 0.18.
And just for context, identical twins raised together in the same house were at 0.58.
The genetic link was providing almost as much correlation as growing up in the exact same household.
They also measured the opposite end of the spectrum, negative emotionality. This trait measures how prone a person is to feeling spontaneously anxious, angry, alienated, or down.
For identical twins reared entirely apart, the correlation for negative emotionality was an incredible, almost unbelievable 0.61. Fraternal twins raised apart were only at 0.29.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize it? Let's be really unequivocally clear about what these numbers are telling us about the human condition.
It means that two human beings who have never met a single day in their lives, who were raised by totally different parents, experiencing totally different childhood traumas and triumphs in totally different cities, share massive foundational portions of their fundamental personality.
They share nearly identical levels of baseline happiness, and they share intense similarities in their negative emotionality, simply and entirely because they share the exact same genetic code.
The blank slate is dead and buried. We are absolutely born with hardwired emotional vulnerabilities and hardwired behavioral inclinations.
And this biological reality becomes even more critical and often vastly more tragic when we transition from discussing normal personality quirks to examining deep psychopathology, when the physical hardware of the mind becomes severely sick.
Let's look at schizophrenia through this heavily genetic lens. This is a severe, debilitating disorder affecting roughly 1 to 3% of the United States population.
And fascinatingly, that rate remains surprisingly consistent across wildly different global cultures, which immediately hints at a biological mechanism rather than a cultural one.
It involves a fundamental, terrifying loss of contact with shared reality.
The symptoms of schizophrenia are genuinely terrifying for the patient. They suffer from intense auditory and visual hallucinations, hearing voices that aren't there.
They suffer from those intricate paranoid delusions we mentioned earlier.
They also often display what psychiatrists call flat affect, which is a total, unnerving lack of any emotional response to things that should naturally provoke deep emotion. Or, conversely, they might laugh hysterically and inappropriately upon hearing tragic news.
It is a profound shattering of the self. So how heavy is the genetic weight here?
The numbers regarding the genetic weight of schizophrenia are absolute, undeniable proof of a biological foundation. If you look at identical twins raised apart, they have a staggering 76% concordance rate.
That means if one identical twin develops schizophrenia, there is a 76% chance that the other twin, even if raised in a wonderful, loving home in a different state, will also develop the disorder.
If they are raised together in the same environment, that concordance rate jumps to 91.5%.
To put the sheer gravity of those numbers in perspective, you're roughly 35 to 60 times more likely to develop schizophrenia if your identical twin has it compared to a random member of the general population. The genetic vulnerability is massive.
But wait, if we look closely at those numbers, that is a crucial but. If schizophrenia was 100% purely genetic determinism, identical twins would have a 100% concordance rate every single time.
76% is huge, but it leaves 24% unaccounted for. So the environment, the psychological lens, must still play a vital role in whether the disease actually activates.
Absolutely. The leading phrase used to describe this interaction is, nature loads the gun, but nurture pulls the trigger.
The biological vulnerability must be present, but an environmental stressor is often required to precipitate the actual psychotic break.
And Dr. Weston highlights a major, highly researched environmental trigger known in the literature as negative expressed emotion.
Let's unpack that term, negative expressed emotion, because it sounds like clinical jargon. What does that actually look like in a real home? Is it just a patient having a bad day or getting into a normal argument with their mom?
It is far more intense and chronic than a normal family argument. Negative expressed emotion refers to a specific, highly toxic family environment characterized by intense open hostility, constant critical remarks, and traumatic emotional overinvolvement or intrusiveness by family members towards the patient.
Studies rigorously show that if a patient is successfully treated for schizophrenia in a hospital, biologically stabilized on medication, and then discharged back into a household dripping with high negative expressed emotion, their rate of psychotic relapse absolutely skyrockets.
The ambient stress hormones generated by that constant hostility literally altered the brain chemistry, pulling the trigger on the underlying biological vulnerability. The hardware is fragile, and the harsh environment shatters it.
So if we look directly at that physical hardware, what is actually physically malfunctioning in the brain of someone suffering from schizophrenia?
The leading biological lens provides us with what is called the dopamine hypothesis. Let's dive into the microscopic mechanics of this because it's fascinating.
Imagine the neural network in your brain.
Hmm.
Information travels down a nerve cell, but the cells don't actually physically touch each other. There is a microscopic gap between the presynaptic neuron sending the signal and the postsynaptic neuron receiving it.
That gap is called the synaptic cleft. For a thought or a sensory signal to travel across that gap, the first neuron fires chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, into the fluid of the cleft.
The second neuron has specialized receptors that catch those specific chemicals, and the electrical message continues down the line.
One of the most vital, powerful neurotransmitters in this entire system is dopamine, which is heavily involved in reward, motivation, and reality testing.
And the dominant hypothesis is that schizophrenic patients essentially suffer from a massive overabundance of dopamine activity.
Either their presynaptic neurons are flooding the synaptic clefts with too much dopamine, or their postsynaptic receptors are hypersensitive. The brain is essentially drowning in excitatory signals, overstimulating the networks that process reality and pattern recognition.
We have two major compelling pieces of pharmacological evidence for this. First, look at the effects of amphetamines.
Amphetamines drastically artificially increase dopamine activity in the synaptic cleft. If you give high doses of amphetamines to a perfectly healthy, normal person, you can actually induce a temporary state of profound paranoia and psychosis that is clinically indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia.
And if you give even a small dose to a stabilized schizophrenic patient, you can immediately precipitate a severe psychotic breakdown.
The mechanics of making the disease worse prove the mechanism. And the second piece of evidence comes directly from the cure, right?
If an overabundance of dopamine signaling is the physical cause of the terrifying hallucinations, what happens if we physically block the signal?
When biological psychiatrists administer antipsychotic drugs, which act as dopamine receptor antagonists, these chemical compounds physically bind to and coat the dopamine receptors on the receiving neuron.
They act like a cap on a bottle. They prevent the receiving neuron from catching the excess dopamine floating in the cleft. And when you physically block that transmission, the schizophrenic symptoms, the voices, the delusions dramatically decrease.
The strict biological lens says, find the specific chemical imbalance causing the symptom and physically manipulate the mechanics of the brain to correct it.
We see deeply similar, highly mechanical biological principles at work in bipolar disorder. The genetic loading here is also immense. The concordance rate for identical twins is roughly 67% compared to just 20% for fraternal twins.
And clinically, 80 to 90% of individuals diagnosed with bipolar disorder have a documented family history of severe mood disorders. It is heavily, undeniably genetic.
But while the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia seem deeply linked to an overabundance of dopamine, the crushing, debilitating lows of severe clinical depression often look neurologically like the exact opposite problem, a critical lack of vital neurotransmitters.
Right, when we look at the neurochemistry of severe depression, the brain might simply not be synthesizing enough serotonin or norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline.
These are the crucial chemical messengers that physically provide the body with energy, motivation, and a baseline sense of well-being.
So, if your presynaptic neurons simply aren't producing enough of these chemicals, or, and this is a common mechanical failure, if those neurons are sucking the chemicals back up into themselves too quickly before the receiving neuron can catch the signal, a recycling process called reuptake, you physically, biologically cannot experience happiness or energy.
It is not a lack of willpower. Your biology is literally locking you in a dark, unpowered room.
And this precise mechanical understanding brings us to the critical turning point in our discussion, how we actually apply this knowledge in modern society to treat these devastating illnesses.
If the medical community views the mind exclusively through this biological lens, the treatment naturally becomes entirely mechanical. We manipulate the chemical soup.
If the patient is hallucinating because there's too much dopamine, we prescribe a receptor antagonist to block it.
If the patient is catatonically depressed because there's too little serotonin in the cleft, we prescribe an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor.
This drug physically blocks the first neuron from sucking the serotonin back up, forcing the chemical to remain in the synaptic gap longer, artificially increasing the chances that the receiving neuron will catch the signal.
We are essentially forcing the broken machine to utilize what little fuel it has.
But this is exactly where the deep dive has to take a turn into some deeply controversial, culturally massive territory.
Because choosing to view human suffering through a specific theoretical lens isn't just a quiet academic exercise for philosophers.
It is a massive, high-stakes ideological and financial battlefield that dictates how millions of people live and die.
There is a tremendous, undeniably positive advantage to the widespread adoption of the biological disease model. It single-handedly removes the crushing burden of moral stigma from mental illness.
For centuries of human history, severe mental illness was viewed through a moral or religious lens. It was a failing of character, a lack of willpower, or even a literal demonic possession. The patient was blamed for their suffering.
But the biological lens fundamentally changes the narrative. It says, no, your brain is simply a physical organ. Just like a liver can develop cirrhosis or a pancreas can fail to produce insulin, your brain can develop a chemical imbalance.
It categorizes mental anguish as a disease, not a sin. It shifts the burden of guilt entirely off the shoulders of the suffering patient.
But, and this is a massive systemic but, is it really that simple? If we just view the unimaginably complex human brain as nothing more than a chemistry set that needs balancing, aren't we losing the fundamental human element?
The source material makes it painfully clear that there is a very dark side to this paradigm shift. The biological lens has become so culturally dominant that it's creating a massive sociological and financial shift in modern psychiatry. And frankly, it is causing immense, undocumented harm to a vast number of vulnerable patients.
Dr. Weston is incredibly explicit and critical about this systemic failure. The financial incentives of modern corporate medicine heavily, disproportionately favor the biological lens.
The systemic corruption detailed in the source material is deeply troubling. Consider the economic reality of a modern psychiatric practice.
If a psychiatrist views mental illness purely as a mechanical chemical imbalance, they're economically disincentivized from spending a full hour doing deep, difficult emotional talk therapy to understand the patient's life.
Instead, they can schedule a 10-minute medication check. They ask a brief checklist of questions about sleep patterns and physical side effects, write a prescription for an SSRI, and immediately move on to the next patient in the waiting room.
Practitioners can churn through patients, making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, acting essentially as high-level pharmacists.
Furthermore, the massive multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry pours vast fortunes into funding exclusively biological research. This naturally floods the scientific literature with biological data, actively shifting the entire scientific paradigm even further away from psychological or environmental understanding.
The lens dictates the funding, and the funding reinforces the lens.
And the actual boots-on-the-ground human cost of wearing these strict biological blinders is devastating. The lecturer shares two incredibly tragic clinical examples of this failure in action.
First, he discusses the case of a young man who had been struggling for 4 agonizing years with severe, paralyzing depression.
What was the root cause? He was desperately wrestling with coming to terms with his homosexuality in a hostile environment. He was experiencing profound identity trauma.
He finally gathers the courage to go to a psychiatrist for help. And what happens? The doctor, viewing him strictly through the biological lens, doesn't ask a single probing question about his life, his relationships, his fears, or his identity.
The doctor just rapidly goes down a sterile checklist of physical symptoms, confidently declares it a chemical imbalance, hands the traumatized man a prescription for antidepressants after a 10-minute consultation, and sends him out the door.
The medical professional completely, totally ignored the profound psychological and sociological trauma the man was actually experiencing.
The second clinical example Dr. Weston provides is, in many ways, just as horrifying regarding the loss of basic human empathy.
Think back to the symptoms of a patient suffering from a severe schizophrenic break. Imagine the ultimate, visceral terror of literally losing your own mind, not knowing what is real, hearing hostile voices whispering inside your head, genuinely believing you're being hunted by the government.
It is a profoundly traumatizing, terrifying human experience. And yet, under the strict, dominant biological model, many of these terrified patients are treated exclusively with antipsychotic pills to chemically suppress the hallucinations.
They are given absolutely zero talk therapy to help them emotionally process the utter terror they are living through every single day. The lecturer forcefully calls this practice preposterous.
To entirely ignore the subjective human experience of suffering and to treat a terrified human being solely as a broken chemistry set that needs tuning is a catastrophic failure of medical empathy.
And this brutal collision of hard biology, subjective psychology, and cultural morality brings us to the ultimate, perhaps unanswerable dilemma of this entire deep dive: sickness versus sin.
If we accept the data, if we truly are biological machines, heavily pre-programmed by our genetics and deeply molded by the chemical impacts of our early environments, how do we ever logically hold anyone morally accountable for anything?
This raises the most important question of all, the classic ancient mind-body or body-soul problem. Dr. Weston brilliantly illustrates the agonizing complexity of this dilemma with the story of a specific sociopath.
This was a court-mandated patient who came into the lecturer's clinical office, openly admitting he was only seeing a shrink, hoping that the documentation would help him secure a lighter prison sentence.
This man presented with absolutely zero clinical conscience. He was highly manipulative, glib, and utterly remorseless.
In the story he tells in the office, it's genuinely sickening. He sits comfortably on the couch and vividly, almost gleefully, describes to the doctor how he systematically tortured a close relative.
He recounts holding a knife to this terrified relative's throat for an entire hour, making horrific, violent, detailed threats, not out of anger, but simply because he was getting a psychological kick out of the absolute terror he was causing another human being. It is the definition of pure, calculated cruelty.
Now, here is the massive complication that throws our entire justice system into a gray area. This man was not psychotic.
He was not schizophrenic. He was not hearing voices commanding him to do this. He was completely lucid.
He knew exactly what he was doing in that moment, and he knew perfectly well that society and the law deemed his actions to be abhorrent and illegal. He possessed free will in the strict technical legal sense. He made a conscious choice to hold the knife.
But we must also look through the other lenses. We know his history. This man was severely, brutally, and repeatedly abused by his own father as a helpless child. His developing brain was flooded with trauma.
Furthermore, medical records showed he had a dense family history of schizophrenia, and modern genetics tells us that heavily carries a higher biological vulnerability to developing sociopathy and lacking empathy.
So I want to bring this dilemma directly back to you, the listener. Yeah. How do you personally judge this man sitting on the couch? Do we hold him strictly accountable?
He was lucid, he physically held the knife, he enjoyed the terror, but if his brain was biologically, genetically vulnerable to a complete lack of empathy from birth, and his childhood environment was a horrific, inescapable crucible of physical abuse that forged that biological vulnerability into a cruel weapon, is he ultimately truly responsible for who he is?
Can you logically or morally blame a man for navigating the world with a totally defective moral compass if he fundamentally did not build the compass himself?
It is the ultimate moral gray area, and there is no easy answer. If a human being is ultimately just the tragic product of compounding forces entirely outside of their conscious control, their genetics, their neurochemistry, their childhood trauma, can we ever really say they are the true author of their actions?
And if we begin to excuse his horrific cruelty based on his biology, where does that logic inevitably stop? Can any of us claim true responsibility for who we are?
When you are kind and generous to a stranger, is that your noble autonomous choice, or is it just the inevitable result of your efficient dopamine receptors and the loving parents you were lucky enough to be born to?
When you act cruelly, is that a moral sin or just a biological misfire in a tired brain?
We have covered an absolutely immense amount of intellectual ground today. We started way back with 19th century phrenologists earnestly rubbing the bumps on people's skulls in a desperate attempt to find meaning.
We looked through Thomas Kuhn's massive tapestries of scientific paradigms, realizing how deeply our theories color our facts.
We journeyed into the spooky Twilight Zone-level similarities of identical twins separated at birth, confronting the reality that our baseline happiness and our deepest anxieties might just be written in the unchangeable ink of our DNA.
And we have waded deep into the profound, deeply uncomfortable moral swamps created by the microscopic synaptic clefts in our brains.
If there's one core actionable takeaway for you as a listener from this entire deep dive, it is to constantly remember the lenses.
The next time you find yourself harshly judging your own sudden emotional reactions, or the next time you feel the urge to utterly condemn someone else for a deep character flaw, force yourself to take a step back.
Remember that we are all fundamentally complex biological machines, desperately trying to navigate incredibly chaotic environments, trying to make sense of the intricate tapestries we have woven in our own minds.
a little bit of grace for yourself and others, and a willingness to simply try on a different theoretical lens can completely change your entire reality.
I want to leave you with one final, deeply mind-bending thought to mull over as you go about your day. We have spent this time talking about how our genetics and our microscopic neurotransmitters dictate so much of our personality and our choices.
Imagine a future, maybe not too far off, where medical science advances so incredibly far that it can perfectly map every single genetic variation in your DNA, every microscopic neurotransmitter fluctuation in your synapses, and every single environmental trigger you have ever experienced that makes you you.
If science reaches a point where it can perfectly predict your every reaction and choice based entirely on mathematical biology, does the concept of the self disappear entirely?
Is your consciousness, that internal voice you hear in your head right now, listening to this, just a helpless, captive narrator sitting in the passenger seat, frantically trying to make up a logical, comforting story for a journey that your biological machine is already driving?
Think about that the next time you feel like you are making a completely free choice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.